Let's build around an assumption that we can get people to come and do this work. Let's make it easier to hire folks. The other thing that I find heartbreaking is in a lot of these scenarios, I have a lot of people saying, I applied to this job and I applied to this job and I never heard back. We should not be dropping all of these incredible, talented people on the floor.
Today on the Daily Scoop podcast from the Scoop News Group, part 2 of FedScoop's exit interview with USDS's Mina Hsiang. Hsiang shares exclusive insights as she closes out her time as administrator of the tech crisis team. It's Tuesday, January 14th, 2025. Welcome to the Daily Scoop podcast, where you'll hear the latest news and trends facing government leaders. I'm the host of the Daily Scoop podcast, Billy Mitchell. Thanks so much for joining me. Before we get to part 2 of that interview, let's dive into today's top headlines. A draft cybersecurity executive order would tackle cyber defenses in locations ranging from outer space to the U.S. federal bureaucracy to its contractors and address security risks embedded in subjects like cybercrime, artificial intelligence, and quantum computers. The draft executive order, which was obtained by CyberScoop, constitutes one big last stab at cybersecurity in the Biden administration's 11th hour. The order is a follow-up to an order published in the first year of Biden's presidency. The new order gives agencies 53 deadlines stretching in length from 30 days to 3 years. The draft EO's opening explains that adversarial countries and criminals continue to conduct cyber campaigns targeting the United States and Americans, with the People's Republic of China presenting the most active and persistent cyber threat to United States government, private sector, and critical infrastructure networks. Those campaigns disrupt the delivery of critical services across the nation, cost billions of dollars, and undermine Americans' security and privacy. More must be done to improve the nation's cybersecurity against those threats. Many of its sections are focused on federal cybersecurity. The tasks include measures such as encryption of federal email messages and requiring contractors to affirm their security commitments, and then having the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency verify them. In particular, it would seek to strengthen CISA's ability to hunt for threats across the federal agencies by doing things like telling CISA to coordinate with federal CIOs and chief information security officers to develop and release a concept of operations that enable CISA to gain timely access to required data. In other news, the Department of Health and Human Services has 3 new officials to lead its artificial intelligence, technology, and data work. According to HHS, Alicia Roald is the department's new Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy and its Chief Technology Officer. Kristen Honey is the department's Chief Data Officer, and Megan Dierks is the Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer. The 3 officials take those roles after HHS announced a reorganization of its health, data, AI, and cyber portfolios in July. As part of those changes, the Chief Technology, Data, and AI roles moved from the department's Assistant Secretary for Administration, where the Office of the CIO is housed, to the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. Mickey Tripathi, the existing National Coordinator for Health IT, also was named Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy, and what was once ONC became ONC/ASTP. For more news at the intersection of the federal government and technology, make sure to visit FedScoop.com. As I discussed last Tuesday, Mina Hsiang, administrator of the U.S. Digital Service, is one of the many technology officials who will depart federal service with the forthcoming change in administrations later this month. Hsiang, a longtime government digital services leader, was tapped to lead USDS at the beginning of the Biden administration and has now seen the role through to the term's end. In the second part of a 2-part exit interview with FedScoop reporter Caroline Nihill, Hsiang gives her closing thoughts as she wraps up her time at the helm of the government's technology tiger team. Let's go now to part 2 of that interview with Mina Hsiang.
You touched on the oversight thing, which was, once again, constantly in my head while you were talking, where I was like, this is the unspoken thing here, which, is a less fun version of, I love nerding out on tech and hearing about all these projects. And also, knowing that oversight bodies are also concerned about how much all of this is costing and looking at technology modernization as these huge projects instead of what we've been talking about, which is incremental, iterative, and so feedback driven. Looking at the financial component of this, I was recently speaking to someone about this. I think was Jennifer Polka, about how like things like the TMF are like all of this money right up front to go back and conduct these projects, when really it's, you know, making products that evolve over time, are serving a purpose in the moment, that can be iterated on, like you talked about. And can you talk about some of the challenges, if you'd like, about the oversight process, and how sometimes it doesn't necessarily play the best with these technology modernization products?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple examples. I guess one thing I would say is, you mentioned the TMF, and I think, so I used to be, for a time, a venture capitalist, and I've been at startups quite a bit. And one of the ways that investors in sort of tech community, like one of the ways that you can manage towards this is having tranched investment. So, you know, frequently you have a seed investment and it's relatively small, and you have a hypothesis about like what people are going to want to buy. And so you all get together and you're like, okay, this is a good hypothesis about what people need. You're a good entrepreneur. We're going to invest in you. And you spend like a bunch of time trying to find product market fit. And, you know, what you come back with for your next investment is not like a full-fledged product and go-to-market plan. You come back with like, okay, we have like de-risked these factors. Like we understand exactly what customers they are. This is the exact gap in the market. This is how much they're willing to pay, right? But it's not like everything. And then everyone's like, okay, you did a good job de-risking that, like a new tranche of money that allows you to solve the next set of problems. And so, you know, companies raise their seed and their Series A and their Series B. And that's sort of how you set expectations about what are we going to learn here. And, you know, sometimes you shift what your final goal is, but you have like a iterative way of investing in that, which takes into account how successful has the team been at executing, in addition to like what other kinds of questions are you trying to solve. And I spent a couple of years on the TMF board, you know, and we definitely have tried to move in that direction, which is to say, like, how do we tranche investments and be more thoughtful about, like, if you have been good at execution and you did the things you said you were going to do for phase one and you learned the things, like being able to make some changes and updates to the investment for phase two, and having that be tied to success in phase one. So I think that ultimately can work pretty well and be helpful, which gets at some of this question about federal budgeting. So one of the big challenges, right? Federal budgeting. I live all the time, and it doesn't have this iterative model. It doesn't say, right now we want you to modernize these systems, so like take a little while to take a little pot of money and a certain amount of time to figure out what approach you want to take, and next year we're going to give you this much money. There's no certainty in it. There's no agreement, and largely it's like a single pot up front, and if you don't spend it in time, you might lose it. So all of the incentives are like against doing like a start small iterative approach. Your incentives are very much pushing you towards like allocating all of that money up front and trying to figure it out. So that is like one of the forces that is constantly pushing you to make non-iterative investment choices. I can also speak to like, I have worked on projects where, you know, as a critical role in the community, GAO will come in and ask questions about like, how's the project doing? And they're trying to provide oversight on, you know, one example is when I was leading our team at HHS during the Obama administration, we were implementing MACRA legislation from Congress to reform payments for Medicare and CHIP. And we had GAO oversight to say, how are you doing on implementation of this? And all of the questions that they ask are very waterfall. They're like, are you on schedule? Can we see the entire schedule? When will this be delivered? When will this be delivered? And, you know, it's a lot of things that aren't like, what have you found about user interaction? What are your doctors concerned about? And how are you going to address those concerns? It wasn't like an iterative set of questions. And there isn't like the friendly back and forth that you would need in order to say, how should we figure out what the right questions are here? So that can really push the agency to, they're like, well, we have to answer these questions. In that scenario, we actually worked through a bunch of it because engaged with some folks who we knew who were engaged with GAO and sort of said, these are pushing towards a less iterative approach. And at the same time, we convinced the agency. And so what we did ultimately for some of those interviews was we did a demo. We were like, we don't have the done product, but here we've been user testing the interaction. Here's like, instead of answering these 100 questions about the future and lots of things that are like actually kind of going to force us to do made up schedules, here's like our process and how we're iterating. And here's the demo of where we are right now. Here's a demo of like how our infrastructure is being built. And we sort of tried to go with like the real world approach of how it was playing out. And I think that worked pretty well, but that is definitely the exception, not the norm.
Yeah. And with that, would you say, like, looking forward, just as you've experienced this and, you know, you have a ton of experience, you've lived a lot of lives. I've stalked your LinkedIn endlessly. You know, do you think that could be a better approach moving forward? I read a million GAO reports. Okay.
I mean, I think, I don't know any like great executive at a product company who doesn't say, show me the demo. What are you thinking? What are people saying about it? And instead is like, show me this. Can you please pull up a Gantt chart? Like, that is not what matters, right? And so I think we need to start asking the right questions about the problem we're trying to solve. Like, decide what problem you're trying to solve. That isn't just sticking to a schedule. It's like, are you trying to make it easier for people to register complaints about challenges that they've had with like medical devices or dog food? Are you trying to make it, you know, more timely for people to get their food stamps? Like, there's many problems to solve, and the opportunity to sort of say, what problem are you actually trying to solve? And how do we know that we're making progress towards solving that problem is very different from like, please make up a schedule and show us how you will be exactly on time.
Which I can see as kind of like, I can imagine that being like, you know, you care about our schedule, but what about all this cool stuff that we're doing that I could show you right now? And, you know, I think that then following that makes me kind of wonder, you know, is this something that you've been kind of advocating for the past 4 years? You know, is that maybe something that like you have been trying to put into action more and more and you know, advocate for that iterative, that feedback, that real world like kind of immersion for when oversight bodies come in and say, well, what's going on? How are you guys doing?
I would say my approach for the last few years has been very focused on building out a corpus of examples that we can then go point to when we want to go advocate. So I think I do think advocacy is important. It is not always super easy from within the executive branch to go try and convince GAO how to do things, right? So my take has been like, the proof is in the pudding. We have during my tenure done over 45 different projects. Let's like do a ton of work, have very clear demonstrations of like process, deliverables, approach, ROI on final outcomes. Like, what objective were we trying to help the agency solve? How did we do against that? What were the key success factors? So it was really about building a corpus of evidence so that then when we want to go have a conversation anywhere about like, this approach is a good approach, you know, nobody wants to take on risk that they don't understand. And the best way to help people understand whether or not something is risky is to point to a bunch of examples that are good comps and say, we could do it like this, and here is a way that it could play out, and here are some of the key factors that will help us get there. And so, and that's much easier than like, please trust me, I come from a completely different industry, and I just think this is going to work great, right? And so I would say, you know, a key, you asked about my tenure here. I think a key thing that I very heavily focused on is demonstrating what is possible from an outcomes perspective, from the public perspective, from a process perspective, transformation and ROI. And that will give us sort of the tools and the ammunition we need to drive more parts of the system over time to change.
Yeah, That sounds pretty phenomenal. It sounds like, I know Dr. Arthi Prabhakar always says like the Biden administration can be summed up in one word, and it's possibilities. When you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, it's possibilities again. uh, which is cool. It's I mean, and it seems like, having that evidence-based incremental feedback approaches is what I hear, especially on Capitol Hill, a lot of lawmakers who are, extending oversight to these modernization products is a lot of what they're saying of, we understand this is what you're trying to do. Where is the proof? Like, where, like, show us. And it's really interesting to hear that from the executive branch as well. And, I wanted to talk about moving forward. Of course, you're leaving on January 19th. You're ramping off as the Trump administration comes in, and I know that Biden administration, USDS, has been doing so much. As someone who has only been here for like a year of that ride, you guys are part of my beat, so I've been following you. But as we get ready for the next administration to come in, and officials have kind of talked about different areas that they expect the administration to go in terms of efficiencies, acquisition, data strategy, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, of course the work isn't done, and of course this work has been continuing and probably will until you're on your way out the door, but what do you expect to see in terms of continued prioritizations for the American public to address customer service needs, user experience needs? What do you think will continue to be issues regardless of administration coming in? What do you think the focus of modernization needs to be across the federal government?
Modernization is an interesting example. I wouldn't pursue modernization simply for modernization's sake. Not to push that back, but I think one of the key questions for us to tackle, and this comes back to what are the objectives, is like, what problems are we actually focused on solving, and how can technology help us do that? And in what ways can technology hurt us in doing that too, right? And taking an approach that, in my experience in the private sector, you basically invest in technology when you want to become more efficient, and it enables you to allow for magical experiences, to allow for a more efficient capability for each of the people who is inside the organization delivering those services and those experiences. And my experience in the government is often kind of the opposite, right? We embark, like, people are hindered by the technology that sits in front of them while they're trying to serve people. And I think that comes from a combination of like a lack of clarity in exactly what problem we're trying to solve, right? I think we can't be trying to solve the problem of getting all the dollars out the door for this modernization at this time. We should be solving the problem of like, how do we make customer service much more efficient and effective in this context? We need leaders inside agencies who really know how to drive that work. So I think we need, we have pushed for this. USDS is all about the people. And I'm incredibly proud of the group of people that are currently at USDS and that we've brought in during this administration. I'm incredibly excited. So we brought in, we've had over the course of this administration over 80 folks from inside USDS who are the kinds of people who understand how to manage operational organizations that incorporate technology and who understand how to build technology in support of, service delivery organizations. Over 80 of those folks have gone to move on to federal roles, which I think is what you need, right? You need people inside agencies in leadership roles who are really driving towards an objective of improving service. And you need the supporting infrastructure around that to at least not hinder those goals. And that requires alignment around the underlying objective. So, you were asking about oversight and how it helps or hurts you on iteration, but iteration in and of itself isn't even the goal, right? Everyone needs to agree, like, okay, we will consider it success if the call center is more efficient, and we will fund you to make that true as long as you can demonstrate that you're making that true. And I think a lot of the combination of like not having operational expertise in organizational leadership in agencies and not having the certainty that you will have, for example, the budget that you will need in order to do things over time. So would I take less money now to have a more consistent stream of funding over 7 years so I can do this modernization or so I can upgrade these systems? Yes, but do I have any way to engage in that conversation with funders? That can be really challenging. And so I think there is a tremendous opportunity to say, let's bring in people who really understand execution and the trade-offs, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend that just every tech company takes on like key questions of how technology discriminates or provides service differentially to people who like does an insufficient job of providing accessible services. Like, we do need to tackle those problems as well. And so you need people who are operationally excellent and people who understand the key trade-offs that happen in a technology-enabled business. And those people can drive. So you need great leaders, and you also really would benefit from, I think there's a real opportunity to sort of drive a more clear and long-term strategy for some of these agencies and for some of these programs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, going back to, you mentioned modernization, not for modernization's sake, but finding, like the issues, and then, not iterating for iterating's sake either, not just being like, this is a cool tool, I think people will like this. But like you had mentioned earlier, are people going to use this? Is this helping people? SDS is, I mean, like, that's the mission. And I wanted to ask, what have been some, I guess common issues that you've seen over the past 4 years that USDS has been trying to, approach in terms of customer. I know, like, overarching, it's customer experience, but would that look like getting in touch with federal agencies? Would that look like, just having a more accessible approach? 408 stuff. What does that look like for you?
One of the biggest challenges we very consistently see is agencies' ability to pull together and drive a set of contractors in a complex requirement environment to deliver both quickly and iteratively and something that is very usable. So user testing is complicated. Front end and back end have to interact appropriately with each other. Sometimes they're managed by different contracts and different teams within the agency, and they don't align perfectly on specifications, and they aren't both allowed to use each other's ticketing system. And all of a sudden you have like a very overhead, process heavy scenario that still isn't very focused on like users and what problem we're trying to solve here. And so I think technical leadership inside agencies is the most consistent challenge that we see. Having a core team of strong leaders with a vision that can then drive all of the work effectively and make sure that that the contracts are written appropriately, that we can iteratively like ensure that the systems and tools that we are building accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. That ends up being one of the extremely consistent problems that we run into. So I guess that's a combination of like technical leadership within agencies in conjunction with contracting and how sort of that is effectuated. So that is a big problem. I'm very excited about the OIRA guidance that I mentioned earlier. One of the consistent problems we run into is what I'll call like fear, uncertainty, and doubt within the agency about what types of user testing they're allowed to do. And it's not that they don't think it would be a good idea, but they're uncertain and they don't want to get in trouble for it. And so then it makes it harder, and you just sort of have more bureaucratic steps every step of the way. We also see that it's incredibly hard for people to do direct user research. So agencies frequently don't have the opportunity to travel or the right tools to go meet with people, the right tools to recruit. And so that can be quite challenging. Another thing that we have made a ton of progress on over the last decade, but it never stops being sort of interesting to me, is this desire to launch something on one day to everyone in America. That is not technologically very feasible. It would be very expensive to build something on day one. You could like roll out to all of America. And then everyone would fill it out on day one and nobody would fill it out later. You would pay a large amount, but also it doesn't give you the ability to continue to improve the system and sort of debug things based on early user feedback. And so companies constantly roll out a beta, early access, sort of different things to help them scale up their infrastructure, scale up their operations, figure out like what actual utilization of the call center is going to look like based on proportional to how many people are in the application. And so building in a way to do that in the context of federal programs is incredibly important. And in the third year of healthcare.gov, the deputy chief of staff turned to me and she said, I guess we should stop doing these big bang launches. And I'm like proud to say that we have had, a lot of soft launch rollouts during this administration, soft launch vaccines.gov and covidtest.gov and online passport renewals and the FAFSA. And, I can talk about a very large number of scenarios where we have sort of changed expectations in the status quo. But every one of those times it's like really hard and not what people are expecting. And so I think creating more of norms and expectations around that will be incredibly helpful as well.
That's super insightful. And, I think that our conversation has touched so many areas. You've answered definitely a lot of my burning questions and hopefully for our viewers, a lot of their burning questions. And of course, as always, it's so great to talk to you, Mina. And oh, thank you. And I wanted to kind of wrap up our conversation by asking you, we talked about so much technology transformation and modernization, as you can tell, is something that I love talking about. But, was there anything that we didn't talk about in this past, almost hour, that you feel is really important to talk about, especially as we're closing out your tenure? Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to share? Anything that you're proud of? Any moment that, you want to document? Anything like that?
I talked a bunch about how one of my key focus areas during this administration is to really put a lot of wins up on the scoreboard so that people could understand what is possible and could build on that. And I think, so I am incredibly proud of that. One of the outputs of that we didn't touch on is that 12 different agencies put in their budget request, which, is not going to become the budget, but is a statement of strategy and priorities and what they would like to do. 12 different agencies put in a request to build a digital service team inside their agency. So if you want to say, are people across government, are leaders across the government convinced that this is a valuable place to invest and an important thing to work on? Absolutely. So then the question is, are we as a nation in the various powers that get to allocate power and money and decisions willing to invest in that? So that's one comment. The other side of that equation that I will also say is the other question that comes up a lot. So there's can you really do things in government? Is government willing to do these things? Absolutely. We just have to decide to do it. Are people willing to come into government and do this? And I guess that's the other thing that I would say has been truly extraordinary. We have had over 5,000 applications a year from technologists across the country. We have an incredible staff. And as I mentioned, people used to be very nervous about coming into these roles and they would say, I only want to do it for 3 months and see. Now like I said, we've had 80 people in the last few years who have gone into agencies to do this for more than their 2 to 4 years at USDS because they are so motivated by the amount of impact that they're able to have and the change they are able to drive with their skills and expertise. And when I go and speak to any types of, I was at Grace Hopper this year. I speak at a number of universities and conferences. The number of people who absolutely want to do meaningful work and do this kind of work, I find overwhelming. It is, and so I think the other huge opportunity is to, there is interest. So let's build a strategy that doesn't assume that just because the salaries are not as high as in tech, that we can't have people who are willing to come and help drive this work. Let's take an approach that really utilizes all of the people who are incredibly motivated and excited to do that work. And so let's build around an assumption that we can get people to come and do this work. Let's make it easier to hire folks, easier to, the other thing that I find heartbreaking is in a lot of these scenarios, I have a lot of people saying, I applied to this job and I applied to this job and I never heard back. We should not be dropping all of these incredible, talented people on the floor. We should be utilizing them because I constantly see across our work that there are gaps that we need to fill there. So figuring out, we have made some big investments in tech hiring in an interagency way. And I hope that continues, but that is a huge and important area. And then I guess lastly, the thing that I do say in those contexts, right, which is we need to talk more about this in non-governmental places. So I was at a business school giving a talk, and I said, have any of you, do you love solving big problems? Do you love managing incredible teams of people and driving them to solve important and incredible problems? If so, consider doing a tour of duty in any level of government. And people were so excited and floored. They had, I had 20 people come up to me after the talk who said, I have never met anybody who worked in government. It has never occurred to me that my skills would be useful in government. But if you talk about how big FEMA is or the VA is, it is clear that someone with management and technical capabilities can be transformational and can lead good work there. And that is what I love to do. So now I'm considering it. Now I'm looking into it, and I will not do it this minute or this year. I have an important job that I'm doing, but now it will be part of what I'm thinking about for the future. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity. And we have to figure out how to pull in and bring those people into the conversation and help make sure that we have roles and that we place people like that as well. So I hope everyone considers that it is, without question, been the most rewarding job of my career.
For more on the ongoing transition in the federal government, make sure to visit FedScoop.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Daily Scoop podcast, available on all podcast platforms. If you've already rated the podcast on your platform of choice, thanks so much. High ratings and good reviews of the show help more people to find it. The Daily Scoop podcast is a production of the Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher help put the show together, and the entire Scoop News Group team contributes. We'll be back tomorrow with more top headlines. Until then, I'm your host, Billy Mitchell. Thanks so much for listening.